Welcome this evening to this very special 5x15 event with Writers Mosaic, and for what is set to be a surprising, moving evening of storytelling with 5 incredible writers. So these writers represent just a fraction of the new writing and cultural innovation that makes up Writers Mosaic, an online platform that celebrates the multiplicity of perspectives, the energy, unpredictability, and global reach of new UK literature. So Writers Mosaic is a new way of looking at the constellations of writers and writing in the UK. It's been such fun working with the team, and it's our honour to have the chance to bring this together. A special thanks to Colin Grant, one of our former speakers at 5x15, who put us in touch and made this all possible. It's such a fantastic group. We're in for a real treat. So thank you for being with us, all of those watching live and on the catch-up. Details for the books are going to be in the chat. Thanks, Stephanie. And Newham Books will be delighted to help you. And first up, it's my pleasure to introduce Gabriel Badamozi, founding editor of Writers Mosaic. He's an Irish and Nigerian poet, playwright, and critic. His London novel, Vauxhall, won the Tybal Jones Page Turner Prize and Best International Novel at the Sharjah Book Fair. His plays include Stop and Search from the Arcola Theatre, Eshu's Faust at Jesus College, Cambridge, and for radio, The Long Hot Summer of '76 on BBC Radio 3, which won the Richard Emerson Award. So welcome, Gabriel. Thank you very much. And over to you.
Thanks very much, Daisy. And good evening, everybody. Right. The format of 5x15, lovely format, is to tell a story for 15 minutes. So I thought I'd tell a story about my reading. As Daisy mentioned, I'm a writer, and I'm also the founding editor of Writers Mosaic, which has an editorial team of writers of colour, supported by the Royal Literary Fund, essentially to explore, question and map what amounts to a step change in our literature. Everyone from everywhere writing in the UK. So let me start this story with my desert island book, The Life and Strange Surprising Adventures of Robinson Crusoe. Now, I'm a great believer in Coals to Newcastle, a desert island book to a desert island. I can picture him looking out alone on the edge of a beach, an empty horizon of the illusions of the sea, and in that mirror, seeing his whole life spread out before him. Self-reliant man, Robinson Crusoe, it's the kind of book you'd expect from a Tory novelist. The interesting thing is Daniel Defoe, this nominal Tory, was actually an undercover agent, a spy for the Whigs against the Tories. So this guy lives on both sides of a very interesting divide between what's real and what's not. Perfect for beach holidays. But let me go back to before that. I don't know about you, but for me, books were the same thing as custard. Yellow, creamy, delicious, hot, steaming, runny custard. Or sometimes lumpy, cold, sweet, thick, juicy yellow custard with the skin on the top. However it came, I wanted seconds. I love food. And in the public library, for me, that's the Durning Public Library in Kennington, the Galanx books of science fiction had these yellow hardback covers. There wasn't one shelf, there was a whole yellow wall of them, and I ate through it like custard. So what can I tell you after that? I was still hungry. What else they got? They had tales from around the world, Japanese myths and legends, emperors descended from gods, tales from the Russian Taiga with Baba Yaga and that hut on chicken legs that runs after you, the heron Shushuga calling for Hiawatha, Finn McCool among my own people, the one who built the Giant's Causeway off the coast of Antrim, who they first told me about in the kitchen at home, and enter Achilles, the myths and legends of the Greeks and their gods, the Trojan Horse, the wise trickster character Ulysses, the 10-year tempest, his magical voyages. I'll call that my anthropological phase. Literature about the world, Homer in Victorian translation. But then I'm grown up, I'm 16. I'm standing in front of my headmaster saying, I want to study English literature at university. What books have you read? Well, the set texts, Shakespeare, Tennyson, William Golding. And what else? I didn't have an answer. No, nothing in there. And you seriously want to read English at university? I hadn't connected it in my mind. By then, I'd been reading solidly for 10 years, anything I wanted, 5 books every 2 weeks. But I didn't know I was reading. I thought I was eating. I was worried I'd eat up the whole library, there'd be nothing left. School books were something else. I'd only studied the ones we'd been given. Meantime, I'd started reading Plato to get back to the Greek gods. No one told me connect Plato in the library at school. As you know, I connected the library with food. School was for your job in the future. The library was your food now. Now, even I can see at some distance that's a tricky mind I've got that characterizes the world in some fairly functional, but nonetheless understandable ways. That's food, that's work. I wanted to go to university because by then I was a poet, and all the poets I could find, except Shakespeare, seemed to have gone to university. I was going to find out what it took. I got there and had a look. I was the only Black British student I met there in 3 years. But I was struck how many accents and regions, cultures and classes there were. It was chalk and cheese. You couldn't get them talking to each other. It really is a social, cultural mosaic. And we really do need the BBC and the NHS, the institutions, to stick us together. I suppose literature is another glue to keep the English as one thing. One of the Welsh poets, Gwyneth Lewis, was a friend. So was the Scottish playwright, Peter Arno. But then I wasn't bound by the class system or, as we have it now, the nations. I was an English-educated foreigner and free to move across the whole bandwidth of cultural and class distinctions in one university. 40 different gradations and counting. Quite an education. But I was a bad student because it was the same thing with reading. I wasn't bound by the curriculum. Full grown. I was still reading Black writers from America, African writers like the fabulist Amos Tutuola, playwrights Wole Soyinka and Athol Fugard, fantasy fiction like Ursula Le Guin, The Hobbit, my personal taste, instead of getting on with the English writers from the syllabus. I'm still reading The Hobbit. I read it to my kids, and they loved me doing the troll voices in my first London Cockney accent. Some people read Jane Austen like that, in a circle, round and round, never stop. They're always reading it. I loved Shakespeare, Dickens, and medieval poetry. I could only get on with Hardy and D.H. Lawrence as poets. You can't do everything. So I started to choose. I wrote about James Baldwin, Athol Fugard, Wole Soyinka, and being Irish, looked at Joyce and Beckett, Kavanagh and Yeats. I went French with Flaubert, Voltaire, Baudelaire, Russian, Dostoevsky, Chekhov, Spanish with Borges, Garcia Lorca, Garcia Marquez, but Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, Freud, and Marx were the revelation. That's when I started to connect up the dots. I had my brain rewired at university. I started to make connections and distinctions. Suddenly, the synesthesia of taste in reading and food began to make sense. You are what you eat, right? Well, I was hungry. You ready for this? I was putting my reading into my body. Now, you know the way some people read with their brain and some maybe with their feelings and emotions, their heart? Think of a recipe book. Some people read for taste with their belly, the taste of the prunes in Armagnac to go with the goose, already there on the tongue. Some think of erotica, read with their balls if they're blokes. Back then, I read with my brain and my belly. I put my heart and soul into it. I was building my body image, my social being, my personality, my capacity for empathy, my mind, my sexuality, all the things plus a few more you're supposed to get from reading. Never mind was it real or not, I was becoming me. My mind was growing bold as light in Greece, wrote an Irish poet, Austin Clarke, of a love affair in The Strange Student. Me too. I had a love affair with literature, and it was nobody's business but my own. Nothing to do with the degree. I wasn't satisfied with being Irish by birth and upbringing, or Nigerian by birth and upbringing, English by birth and education, all of them by now. I wanted to be in a love affair with the whole written world, even a world in which relationships go wrong. Something Plato said, love is a road to what's real. You escape your lonely cave because the other person out there becomes real for you and expands your grasp of reality. I'm not saying I treated books as people to meet, but I am saying I liked books and I liked people. I liked to meet them and I liked to read them, as you're reading me now, the one bleeding into the other. It gave me a lot of practice, books and people, people and books. Plato's teacher, Socrates, who never wrote a book, wouldn't approve. But you can't please everyone. And Plato wrote dialogues, putting people in books, including Socrates, to speak to each other and get real. It's about the relationships, the connections and differences. Now, back to Robinson Crusoe. And of course, his man, Friday. What a relationship. Crusoe's had a shipwrecked dog as a companion, a shipwrecked goat and a parrot, but Friday is a man. What kind of man? You won't learn his name or his language. You'll have to wait till he can speak English. Is he an equal, a servant, a slave? Because, you know, Crusoe did a bit of slave dealing. But let's pass over that in silence it deserves, the whole master-slave thing. Human beings as beasts of burden, farm animals. I didn't say you don't find monstrous things in reading, you do. And what isn't said is always as interesting as what is. Maybe their relationship was purely homosexual. Who's Friday? In a way, Defoe can't tell us. He's a projection. You hear Crusoe looking at him while he's asleep. That's a good-looking guy. Not quite black, very agreeable, though not very easy to describe, he writes. And close the book. But we've got Girl Friday and Man Friday in all the job ads. He won't go away. Who is he? Well, he's a cannibal. Apparently, he still had a hankering stomach after you know what. But let's hear it from him. What's it like being a cannibal? You want to get his side of the story. it isn't complete without that. In the end, he comes back to these islands with Crusoe. What did he think of custard? What's good is, we're here now. We can tell you. So let me give way to the other writers of Writer's Mosaic, the ones I'm reading now, the ones like me who bring other sides of the story. Because as you know, our literature now is a kaleidoscope of colours and perspectives, of insights and hindsights, readings and rereadings, the return of our global adventures from the shipwreck of empire. All our illusions and delusions spread out before us. Here we are, Writer's Mosaic. I hope you enjoyed it.
Gabriel, that was so fantastic. I love the idea of a love affair with the whole written world, and a very inspiring start to kick us off this evening. Thank you so much, and to everyone at Writer's Mosaic. So Vauxhall is out now, and Newnham Books will be delighted to help you get a copy. And now we have Angela Saini, who is one of our old friends and favorite speakers from 5x15, and we're thrilled to welcome her back to our virtual stage, where she joins us from New York. She's a science journalist and author. She presents radio and TV programs on the BBC, and her work has appeared in the Sunday Times, Nature, New Scientist, The Guardian, Wired, National Geographic, and many more places. She's won a number of national and international journalism awards, and her latest book is called Superior, The Return of Race Science. And it was published in 2019 to widespread acclaim. Her previous groundbreaking book was Inferior, How Science Got Women Wrong, and it's been translated into over 13 languages. Both are on university reading lists around the world, and it's a thrill to have you back with us. Welcome, Angela, over to you.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to listen to Gabriel, and I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to speak on this incredible panel. I can't wait to hear what everyone else has to say, but I just want to say how thankful I am to Colin, Gabriel, and Writer's Mosaic, and Daisy at 5x15 for giving us spaces like this. Now, I'm a journalist whose work is about looking at the long legacies of discrimination and how we think about ourselves in the present. And I've spent the last 2 years almost in hibernation, like so many of us, working on a book about the origins of patriarchy. One theme that always seems to come up in my work, in my previous books, and this one, is how we cling to narratives about good and evil. Nothing really brought that home to me quite as vividly, though, as watching the statue of Edward Colston being ripped down by protesters in Bristol in the summer of 2020 and seeing it dragged into the harbour. People feel strongly about statues. I know, because this is a debate I've often been drawn into myself professionally when it comes to renaming lecture theatres or in my work with museums. But personally, I've always been suspicious of statues. In fact, I tend not to have any heroes at all. And the reason for that is that I don't like the thought, the idea of elevating any human to that kind of status. And the reason for this, in turn, or one of the reasons, is that people almost always end up disappointing in one way or another. And I can tell you this because a lot of my time is spent looking deep into the histories of scientific and feminist heroes. Charles Darwin, let's take him. He held very deeply sexist views. He thought that women were the intellectual inferiors of men, that we're even lower down on the evolutionary ladder. Virginia Woolf wrote in a diary entry how she felt people with severe intellectual disabilities should be killed. And I can't tell you how many celebrated American suffragists were deeply racist, willing to throw Black women under the bus to see white women given the franchise first. When you look, there are in fact very few people in our history who are able to emerge from this kind of 21st century analysis with some stains on their biography in some way, or at least what we call stains. And even in our own time, we're so routinely disappointed, and maybe more so because social media makes it easy to hear people's private, unfiltered thoughts and share them around the world in a heartbeat. In the years before she passed away, and this is something people have asked me about my opinion. Even the beloved Ruth Bader Ginsburg criticized Colin Kaepernick for refusing to stand for the national anthem before later apologizing. Now, I could go on for a very long time. I'm not here to categorize people into good and bad. The point I'm trying to make is that even though you've heard so many of these stories already, maybe you've already felt conflicted about someone you idolized, the challenge for us in these situations is to figure out what we do with the knowledge that people we respect are morally imperfect, that someone can inspire us on the one hand and oppress on the other, that they can see one person's suffering, but not someone else's. And it's that paradox that we find so hard to process. I sometimes think that part of the reason for this is maybe that we've been raised on fairy tales and fables that tell us that someone is either a good egg or they're a bad egg. They're either fresh or they're rotten. They can't be both. In that moral binary, we don't just judge individuals, though. We also judge nations. We all have in our heads an idea of which countries are the good ones and which ones are the bad ones, the ones that occupy a different moral ground that we have an ethical problem with. In Britain, what's always surprised me is that this is a country so convinced that everyone in the world believes it is one of the good ones. Part of the tension we've seen around efforts to decolonize academia, to move statues or take them down, to broaden histories, to include the so-called bad bits, lies in the fact that so many Britons, at least in my experience, find it so hard to accept anything other than this narrative of good and evil in which Britain is good. It won the world wars. It fought against fascism. It overcame the bad guys. How can Britain not be the good one? The bad nations are over there. Germany, Russia, Saudi Arabia, China, they surely are the bad ones who've committed human rights abuses, who trample over rights. They're the ones who deserve to be judged. Britain is somehow beyond reproach. What we don't realize, or what some don't realize, is that in the rest of the world, outside Western Europe at least, Britain has never been seen this way. In countries colonized by the British are the bad guys. In this fairy tale, they're the villains. They were the ones who trampled over rights and freedoms, who behaved unethically, who were cruel and vicious. India, where my parents were born, didn't thank Britain for colonizing it as much as some people would like to think that it did. In fact, I had a conversation with someone today who felt that way. It fought desperately for independence for decades. If you've lived in Asia or Africa or the Middle East, from that perspective, the British are the villains in the same way that for the British for a long time after the Second World War, and I think maybe in some people's imaginations even now, Germans were the villains. If any of you have seen the Bollywood movie Lagaan, which is now more than 2 decades old, you'll have seen this narrative play out for yourselves. Now, if you don't know it, Lagaan was this hugely popular, massively expensive film. It's set at the end of the 19th century, and it's about an arrogant British Army officer who challenges a group of poor Indian villagers to a cricket match, telling them that if they win, they don't have to pay these enormous taxes that they owe the government, which they can't afford anyway. So these Indian villagers learn to play cricket and eventually win the game. It's an anti-colonial movie. I mean, it's set up that way right from the beginning, and it's quite obvious who the bad guys are. And of course, you will see British bad guys in other movies too, not just in India, but actually all over the world, including fairly often here in Hollywood. The moustache twirling upper class British villain is a trope in itself. And we have to ask ourselves why that is. Why is it that in Britain, there is so much reluctance among some, including this government, to see what to the rest of the world has always been so completely obvious, that as a colonial power that exploited so much of the world out of greed and racism, Britain is not morally perfect? Why are people afraid of that? How does a nation confront its moral imperfection? How does it reconcile its history with its self-image? Well, in the case of our current political leadership, the tendency has sometimes been to stick its head in the sand, to order museums to leave statues exactly where they are, to even threaten to take away their funding, which it has done, to push back against so-called negative histories, to deny any hope of decolonization, to essentially pretend that Britain is pure, that it's a good egg, when of course bits of it have always been rotten. In a way, British Asians, Black Britons, and other minorities, we're well placed to understand this. We live between cultures. We have to code switch. Our loyalties are tested when we watch international cricket matches. We live that moral complexity every day. And that's crucial to understanding why people like me sometimes feel so conflicted about being British, because we're trapped between two fairy tales, one in which Britain is the hero and the other in which Britain is the villain. And of course, we are British. I'm completely British. I want to feel proud of this country that I belong to. We all want to feel comfortable here. But it's impossible to do that under this strange cognitive dissonance. How can you do that in a state that asks you to choose just one fairy tale and pretend that it's the whole truth, to deny facts that you know to be true? Now, I'm someone who works inside the establishment sometimes as well as outside it. I sometimes consult for museums and scientific institutions and universities. And I see that nervousness, that desperate desire to maintain that fairy tale. Part of me sometimes wonders whether the intransigence of this government to even think about empire and its evils betrays a fear that starting down this road of writing history more fairly, of confronting the mistakes of the past, a road that many other countries have already taken, including Germany and South Africa. Even here in the US, they now commemorate Juneteenth as a federal holiday, marking the end of slavery. That doing this in Britain might somehow open Pandora's box. Then it would all come out. And then what? Then Britain might be left wondering for the first time whether it really hasn't been on the right side of history after all. I can understand that fear. No person, no people want to have their failures exposed. This maybe explains, I think, some of the panic around cancel culture, because in the public eye, people fear it so much, I wonder, because not just because of freedom of speech, because that's often the defense, but if they're honest, because deep down they fear that they might be next. And they really could be. In fact, any of us really could be, because as I said at the beginning, nobody is perfect. Good people are capable of bad things sometimes. That's the human condition. When we lionize individuals, then, we forget their humanity. We ignore their complexity, something that's intrinsic to who they are. We don't allow them the space to reveal themselves or give them room to grow and become better. I can't help thinking whether nationalism in that sense is a kind of state level hero worship. It's like creating a statue, a memorial to the state. It's the same. It behaves as though a country is exceptional, beyond error, superhuman. And in doing that, nationalism runs a risk of failing to see that countries are morally complex as well. They too need to be recognized as they are by their citizens, not presented in some kind of airbrushed, artificial version, but as they are, with their rotten bits. That's not to say that we should forgive wrongs or brush them aside, but that we should see them. A healthy country is one that can see its history as it is, make amends for it in the present, and be confident enough in itself to say, we're not perfect, but we can do better. And the only way that really happens is by confronting the facts, not shying away from them, from looking at all these tales, all these narratives, not just clinging to one of them. If we can't do that, people get suspicious. It's like the picture of Dorian Gray. Something doesn't seem right. It's odd. In that bargain with the devil, in which we pretend that everything is fine, that history is completely rosy, that's where the rot starts to spread. And these days, I start to worry that it already has. The nationalism we see in Britain now, the government-sanctioned head in the sand type of nationalism, living in this imaginary past, is unsustainable now. Because even if it's possible to maintain that illusion that the apple isn't rotten for a while, you can't do it forever. Sooner or later, people will notice the smell and they'll start to ask, what are you trying to hide? They're already asking that. When they tear down statues, that is them asking.
Thank you so much, Angela, for being with us all the way from New York. It was so wonderful to hear you, and that was a brilliant, brilliant speech. Superior and Inferior are both out now. And next up, we have Paul Mendes, a novelist, essayist, and screenwriter. In 2020, Dialogue Books published his debut novel, Rainbow Milk, examining queer Black British lives from the Windrush generation to the aftermath of the Brexit vote, to critical acclaim, featuring in the Observer's prestigious top 10 debut novels list for 2020 before being shortlisted for the Orwell Prize. Mendes has contributed to Glass, Esquire, The Face, British Vogue, and the TLS, as well as the Brixton Review of Books. And his work has been included in anthologies by Goldsborough Books and Daunt Books. And it's an honor to have you with us, Paul. Thanks for being here, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Daisy, and thank you to Gabriel and Colin and to everyone involved with 5 by 15 and the Writers Mosaic. Angela, I just have to say, I really loved your piece. It so much resonated with me. And my piece kind of follows on a little bit from that, but from, I guess, a quite specific perspective. Just in terms of thinking about permanence and the way statues are treated. I've been similar to you in arguments with people about, statues such as the Colston, such as the Cecil Rhodes, and people defending them will say, that's our history. You can't sort of turn your back on history. That's what happened. But what I'm experiencing as I get older is that some people's histories aren't as permanent, but that doesn't mean they're less important. And I wrote a short story kind of back in August 2020 as a sort of initial response to losing my grandmother's house, which was a council house, after she passed away. I sort of didn't think anything of this story until recently when I went to the Tate Britain to see the Life Between Islands exhibition and saw the Afro-Caribbean front room that had been installed there by Michael Macmillan. And I think we have a picture of it here. So it's a 1970s Afro-Caribbean living room. And I walked in not expecting to see it at all and was almost sort of floored by it because of the amount of things that I recognized from my grandmother's house, from my own childhood, from the homes of other Afro-Caribbean immigrants. The carpets, the ornaments, the drinks cabinet, etc., etc. And it led me to remember that I had actually photographed all of the rooms in my grandmother's house just before she died, including the front room, which will be our next slide. So this was my grandmother's front room as she left it. This was two days before she passed away in October 2019. And this is actually the screensaver on my laptop. So I'm always sort of reminded of that house, which I was basically born into. And so I kind of came back to this short story that I wrote, and I don't know whether to call it a short story or not, but it's a sort of personal response to that space and to losing it. My grandmother's neighbors, both sides, are quiet South Asian families who watched an ambulance take her away at night and have begun to suspect she's not coming home. As I approach her gate, jangling my keys, one of the elders, washing his car in the October sunshine, nods at me. "How is she?" he asks. "Good," I reply. "Cheers." I dip my head to discourage further questioning. She's always hated anyone knowing her business. Her garden looks absolutely terrible. Never seen it anything like this. Strong weeds up to mid-thigh, hardier than any shrub. I'll clear all this for her, I tell myself, even if she'll never know. I unlatch the little wooden gate. Everyone in my family knows that sound, a high click. And for anyone sitting in the front room, it means the excitement of visiting auntie or uncle, or even just the insurance man. It's a contentious sound because the gate has to be shut, and it has to be shut firmly, yet quietly. In recent years, it's expanded and now needs lifting into the latch, which I do, even though she won't be there to shout at me for not doing so. I check myself for only respecting her wishes now she's on her deathbed. The familiar creak of the front door opening. Nobody's smoked in this house for 20 years, but I'm still greeted with traces of the smell deep in the carpets. Home. For a moment, I forget as I open the front room door. Silence. Back in the day, I'd sit and read the paper with a cup of tea, ignoring the horse racing or whatever was on TV, until my grandmother came in with a miraculous tray of cooked food, leftover stew beef and hard food, perhaps. You want some hot pepper? She'd ask, and she'd go to fetch it for me, barefoot, feet hip-width apart. I close the front room door without going in and hang up my bag and coat in the hallway. Her kitchen. What a mess. Cupboard doors open, piles of unopened mail among remnants of stale bread and Jamaican bun on the table, unwashed plates in the sink, a black sack overflowing with KFC packaging and empty 2-liter Pepsi bottles next to the bin, a multi-pack of Walker's crisps with only the ready salted left. As soon as her back is turned, perhaps it's a protest. Pans on the stove. I lift the frying pan lid, expecting to find a generous serving of leftover ackee and saltfish. Dry. Even the kettle's gone to the hospice. It doesn't occur to me to dig out the old stove kettle from the back of a cupboard. She never threw anything away. I haven't told her I love her. Well, I have, but in that slightly mocking, love you, Nan, kind of way people use when they'll see them again in a day or two. I return to the front room, a sun trap, and sit down. Opposite the run of simple terraced houses is a wild bank choked with weeds and wiry knotted trees. The sun shimmers through them onto the back wall, illuminating columns of dust motes. As soon as the hospice carers informed us they were no longer going to give her food or drink, an uncle unplugged the front room telly and Sky Plus receiver and put them in his car. They are in his name, in fairness. Dark halos of dust and grime mark the absences of framed family portraits that have been removed to the hospice, as if my grandmother might wake up and be fooled that she's actually at home, surrounded by daughters, granddaughters, and nieces, all shouting over each other, nobody waiting for whoever is speaking to finish, the conversation frothing and crashing like waves. In its heyday, 20 or more people might be packed in this little room, drinking bottles of beer, cans of Mackeson, or glasses of Synatogen wine, telling each other stories, throwing back their heads against the woolly orange antimacassars and slapping their thighs with laughter, waiting for someone female to bring them their tray of food. I look around at the inanimate objects that saw all those days. A glass Christian fish, a wooden flamenco dancer in a silky yellow frock with black fringing, a rosy-cheeked China shepherdess with her dog and lambs, a never-used porcelain teapot depicting an English equestrian scene, a wall clock that only told the right time twice a day, an uncle's trophies from when he was a promising striker before he ruptured cruciate knee ligaments, a plaque that said, "Christ is the head of this house, though no one in it ever went to church. A little ship in a bottle. A drinks cabinet full of best glasses that came out every Christmas. Worthless, mass-produced objects every Jamaican household has, but that I can't throw into the boot of a car because I've never learned to drive. An uncle has already put his name down for the mahogany chest at the bottom of my grandmother's bed, full of her decades-old, well-kept frocks that'll probably end up in black sacks being driven to the nearest charity shop or clothing bank. Some white goods are going to another uncle to furnish a flat he's lived in for over a decade. An auntie, who was her father's favorite, will be taking his old armchair. The other auntie, the middle child, hasn't decided yet what she'll take. She's been the one organizing everything, and she's tired. The rest will be cleared by men with great big hands and dirty nails who've never touched these precious things before and won't know what they mean. My grandfather's motto had been, when you buy a house, them keep you for life. If you rent, you pay every month and you never owe them more than that. They lived for today, as if they might one day just up and return to Jamaica, but they stayed until it was time to die. The council will repossess the house 28 days after her death. We've grown up here. This is our heritage, our memories. 37 years we've filled this house up with things we couldn't throw away. Now we've got no choice. I find myself back in the kitchen as if unable to believe there's no food in my grandmother's house. I feel like I should make a start clearing up, but it would take days alone. So many layers. The plastic carrier bags she keeps because they destroy the planet if you throw them away. Glassware, dinner services, cutlery, her little Fulton umbrella by the back door, the ashtrays from when my grandfather used to smoke, piled up in their own little space under the crockery cupboard. Mugs reserved for relatives who are now dead and gone. She hates waste. If she dished up anyone dinner, they would have to scrape the plate. But none of her children can cook like her. Her housecoats hang on the kitchen door, next to a plaque on the wall above the deep fat fryer, the shape of Jamaica, with the locations of Kingston, Montego Bay, and Ocho Rios marked, and the national emblem, the ackee berry, painted on in red, yellow, green, and black. Slavery took our ancestors to Jamaica against their will, and their descendants' needs brought them to England, where they found jobs in factories, moved into one council house after another, and filled this last one with cheap shit until they died. I've never been to Jamaica. My parents haven't either. And so it feels as if my link to that country is dying with my grandmother. So I'm free to leave it all behind. I don't have to stay here and clean up. I don't have to stay in this country even, because my needs are different from theirs. I can live anywhere in the world and set down roots of my own, migrate, even if for the same reason my grandparents did, to build a better life for myself. But there needs to be permanence. So there's nothing I can do but photograph every room in the house as she left it. Her bedroom, the bed sheets exactly as they were when she was taken away, the tape measure over the door to ward off evil spirits. I zoom in on the carpets, which have been there since they moved in. I capture her headscarves neatly folded in a drawer, all the pairs of glasses she kept. And in a back bedroom, I find her wedding album. She in a high-necked, long-sleeved white dress, concealing her bump. My grandfather looking handsome in his black suit and white gloves. One of them going, the other long gone. Everything they've worked and lived for is about to be cleared to landfill, apart from a few photographs, bits of furniture and jewelry their children will argue over. I slip my phone back in my pocket, run downstairs and out the front door, locking up and posting the keys through the letterbox. She won't remember or care about the garden. The neighbor has gone back indoors. I firmly but quietly lift the latch into the gate behind me. And I just want to add one last thing, because yesterday I was with a friend who runs a junk shop, and I found this, which I'm so happy to now have. My grandmother had one of these on her windowsill, and it's one of those things that people in the family would have thought was worthless and that would have been taken away. So I'm glad to have found one almost exactly the same, which I will cherish forever.
Paul, thank you so much. That was so beautiful and so moving. Thank you so much for sharing the story of your grandmother with us this evening. Rainbow Milk is out now, and I know there's a slew of incredibly exciting big projects for the screen that are coming soon, including an adaptation of Rainbow Milk, and we'll be looking out for them. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
And now it's a great honor to introduce Ingrid Persaud. She's a late bloomer to the world of literature, having studied law at the LSE and worked as a lawyer, indeed teaching law at King's College London. But she went on to transform herself into an artist. She studied fine art at Goldsmiths College and Central St. Martin's, and she later worked as a visual artist. And then she published her debut, Love After Love, her novel, which came out in 2020 and won the Costa First Novel Award and the Author Club First Book Award for 2021 and the Indie Book Award for Fiction for 2021. Other prizes include the BBC National Short Story Award 2018 and the Commonwealth Short Story Prize in 2017. So welcome, Ingrid, and thank you so much for being with us.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here. Thank you to 5x15 and to WritersMosaic. Dig and you'll find my navel string buried deep beneath Trinidad's soil. The southernmost in a chain of Caribbean islands stretching from Florida to Venezuela, my birthplace seemed the natural setting for a debut novel, Love After Love. The only problem is I had left at 18, which is a few years ago, and invoking an authentic sense of Trinidad surely demanded more than the fleeting visits I'd managed over the decades. I wrote the first draft full of unease. What if the Trinidad I'd been so tenderly recreating on the page had vanished? What if it had never existed? Everything I'd written could have been simply the nostalgia of self-exile. So I had to return. Readers were owed more than memory, research, and Google Earth. While shiny new towers punctured the skyline, the birthplace of Steelban and Calypso had retained its essential vibe. Imagine my relief when I stopped for gas and the pump attendant asked what I did, just making conversation the way Trinis like to. And I told him I was a writer, and he was delighted. He said, I'm a slam poet, and immediately invited me to a gig he was doing that weekend. So I pulled off, and drove south from Port of Spain to San Fernando, my hometown, grateful that economic progress had not dimmed the warmth of Trinidad. But I'd forgotten another type of warmth, which is the stinging midday sun. Thankfully, I spotted a vendor advertising beastly cold drinks, of which I had to have one. Horns and car stereos blared as I crawled through yet another traffic jam. We just specialize in traffic. And I passed several makeshift roadside stalls overflowing with freshly picked fruit and vegetable, just mounds of them. And I bought Julie mangoes, which are truly the fruit of the gods. And after years of buying, herbs in tiny little plastic bags in the supermarket, I couldn't resist, a whole big bunch of coriander to eat, to cook with, when I was making, probably curried eggplant later. And the eggplants aren't the little ones you get here in the supermarkets. They're huge, foot-long ones, and they just cost a few dollars. So my novel is littered with beaches, villages, monuments, shops that I'd mentioned, and I wanted to make sure they all still existed, and they were still what I thought they were. And my first stop was San Fernando Hill, searching for the bench that I'd placed a character who was picnicking with his lover. And I had talked about the view that they would see. So I had to find the bench and find the view. And it was such a relief to find that the view was as I had imagined it. And there before me was, the sprawling city I'd grown up in, built on the banks of the Gulf of Paria. And while in San Fernando, I had to have our favorite, it's our national food, I think, doubles. And Gabriel mentioned, reading as food and literature as food. There's a lot of food in my book. And if you've never had a doubles, you really have to. And if you search in most big cities, if there's a West Indian restaurant, they will serve doubles. And doubles are essentially two fried, spicy dough kind of pieces. And it in between is this curried chana or chickpeas. And you top it with a bit of tamarind sauce, little pickled cucumber, and we always say in Trinidad, slight pepper, but beware, slight, it means different things to different people. And everyone has their favorite doubles person. And Ali's doubles are supposedly the family who started with doubles in Trinidad. And so I have a particular affinity to going and finding an Ali's doubles. And one of the interesting things about food in Trinidad is that it is like so much else of the culture, the blend of the culture that is from the East Indians. It comes from indentured laborers who replaced slave labor. So they came between sort of 1845 and 1917. And in Trinidad alone, we had about 150,000 indentured laborers. And they came with their food and their religion and their customs, and nothing changed. So from an anthropological point of view, we have this ossified 19th century Indian culture. So we have things like rotis. We have one called bosup shut because it looks like a torn bit of cloth. And we have a silky roti called dalpuri. And you only find these in the regions of Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, possibly still, because that's where our ancestors came from. But we also have other reminders of that 19th century crossing of the Kalapani or the Blackwater to get to a better life in Trinidad. And one of the stark reminders that you find when you journey around Trinidad is the Jundis. And Jundis are these colorful prayer flags on bamboo poles. And they're always at the sort of front of a good Hindu home. But if you ask an Indian from India, they're like, we don't do that, But if you're Trini, you definitely would do that. I wanted to visit other places. I wanted to, keeping with this theme of food, I wanted to see if Pat Traj still made the best roti, and yes, they did. And I wanted to drink a red solo drink because it was part of my childhood. And one of my characters is called Solo, who likes a solo drink. And I also wanted to see the Temple by the Sea. And the Temple by the Sea is a shrine built by a lone Hindu devotee, and it now forms part of a much broader complex with an 85-foot tree of Hanuman, the monkey god. And while I was there, I was drawn to the sights of the dying embers of a funeral pyre. And, it was still smoldering. And if you've, our concept of death by cremation in the West is so sanitized. Well, it's not in Trinidad if you choose to go the route of your ancestors, if you're Hindu. And that means an open pyre outside where the body is placed. And it's very visceral, very, very difficult to watch. And my last stop on my whistle tour of Trinidad to ensure my facts were up to scratch was an old favorite. It's the Carney Bird Sanctuary, which is an enormous protected mangrove wetland where the Carney River meets the Gulf of Paria. And the Carney River regularly bursts its banks during the rainy season and pretty much divides the country into north and south. And it's lovely. You can take a little tour and you go on this boat, and it slows down in the middle of this open area in the mangrove swamp. And you sit there in silence and you wait for the sun to go down. And as the sun goes down, something invisible tells all of these hundreds and hundreds of birds to come home. We saw herons, egrets, kingfishers, and there are about 186 different species. But by far the most spectacular thing is to watch our national bird, the scarlet ibis, come home. And they come in and they flock to these trees and they light them up like, sort of Christmas baubles, these red Christmas baubles in the trees. And it's incredible. But there was something new on this trip for me, which I hadn't ever seen before. There were pink flamencos that had migrated from Venezuela and made their home in the Carney Bird Sanctuary. And I thought maybe they had followed the Venezuelan refugees who have now integrated into Trinidadian life. And it made me think of longing and belonging and non-belonging, and being okay with a space where that liminal space of neither belonging or not belonging, a space where you can be critical and think about things and engage, but with some distance. And my home continues to change, but dig deep, and you'll still find my navel string is buried there. Thank you.
Ingrid, thank you for that extraordinary description. It was so evocative and mouth-watering as well. I really want to try all of those delicious foods, including the double. Love After Love is out now, and I know that everyone will want to read after hearing you. So thank you. And our final speaker this evening is Geoffrey Boache. He's an author, broadcaster, educator, and journalist, originally from Brixton, and his first book was called Hold Tight, Black Masculinity, Millennials, and the Meaning of Grime, and it's recognized as one of the first seminal books about grime music. Blacklisted, Black British Culture Explored is his second major book, published under Dialogue Books in 2018. And his illustrated compendium, Musical Truth, A Musical History of Modern Black Britain in 28 Songs, was published in June 2021. He's also co-host of BBC Radio 4's Add to the Playlist with Cerys Matthews, and he continues to be an educator, providing training and talks to schools and organizations on topics of race, masculinity, and education. So welcome, Jeffrey. Thanks so much for being with us, and over to you.
All right. I'll get straight into it. When you're writing a book, right, when you're in that process, there's a very scary moment when you get the title wrong, all right, because you don't have a title in your head from the beginning, not always, and it usually changes. And actually, when I was writing what came to be known as Blacklisted, I thought I had the title a few months before I stumbled across the actual title. So let me tell you a story about that. I go into school, because I'm teaching at this point in East London, and I've got my tutor group who I've known since they were 11 years old, and they're like hitting about 14 now. They're at the age when they're cleverer than you are, you know, and they are really excited because their form tutor's got another book out, so they can see that I'm making moves. And I go, all right, I've got this book. It's about Black identity. It's about what it means to be a Black man in this country. I'm going to call it H is for hairline. All right. And then there's silence because it's a terrible title. And then one of my students, I won't call her by name, but she just puts her hand up and goes, sir, you can't call your book H is for hairline. It doesn't make any sense. Like, what are you talking about? And I've got really good reasons why I want to call it H is for hairline. Because, you know, first of all, I don't know if you've noticed, I've got a hairline. Like, this is a big deal. You know, this is a big deal in certain circles, having a hairline, which is straight across. That's the way you get the good hairline. It's got to be a razor sharp line straight across there. And that's a big part of my identity as a Black man, because, you know, we get our haircut every like 4 hours. That's kind of what it feels like sometimes. We're always getting a haircut. And getting that hairline is a big part of presenting yourself to the world. Now, there's a whole history that comes with that. And that's my second story to you. My second story is about how I came to have haircuts that were so important to me that it almost became the name of my second big book. When I was really small, I would go to the main road. I lived on an estate in Brixton. I'd walk out of the estate and I'd go to the main road, and there was a barbershop, a tiny barbershop. And I'd be there first with my dad when I was really small, but then as I got older, he'd give me a bit of money and I'd go on my own, and I'd go to the barbershop and I'd sit in the barbershop. And I usually was terrified because I'm away from home. You don't quite know who's about you. So I have a book with me. And I was always a big reader, always a big bookworm. So I'll be sitting in the corner just reading. And the barbershop is a barbershop. It's kicking off. There's people arguing, talking about sports and life and love and philosophy. There's music. There might be a television in the corner, people coming and going, money exchanging hands. And I'll just be sitting in the corner, waiting patiently, reading my book. All right. And in many ways, if you want to talk archetypes, because every story's got archetypes in it. We know the big ones, hero, villain, you know, but there's a whole long list of archetypes. I was the innocent, you know, me, small me, with my book in the corner, getting my little haircut. Skip forward a few years, and I probably had, I don't know, I can't do the maths right away, but I said that we get a haircut maybe every couple of weeks. I've had hundreds of haircuts at this point. Skip forward into my adolescence, and I stumble across comics. Dun, dun, dun. Comics found me and became something of a passion. I didn't realize that I would love comics so much, but I did. And comics come with a price tag. They're expensive, all right? Especially you have to get them every week. So I've now got a conundrum because I haven't got enough money to fund my new habit. So what do? I find a way of getting the money. I decide that if I can keep the money from my haircuts, because remember, I get a haircut every 2 weeks, serious money. If I can somehow keep hold of that money, I can use it to buy comics, and I don't know what's going to happen to my hair. Solution. See, I'm clever. But that means I'm going to have a terrible, terrible haircut most of the time. And that's not so good. So what do? I think about it. And I go home and I go to my mum and I go, Mum, I've got a plan. You're going to give me like £15. Mum's looking at me now like I'm crazy, but I carry on. and I'm going to go to Brixton Market and buy my own clippers. I'm assuming you can buy this stuff there. I'm going to cut my own hair, and then the money that Dad gives me for my haircut, I can keep and I can spend on comics. I didn't tell her that last part of the plan. I just said that I was going to buy my own clippers. Skip forward, and now I'm cutting my own hair. Terribly, okay? My haircuts are bad at this point, as you can imagine, because I hadn't quite worked out, first of all, that just because you can't see the back of your head, it doesn't mean that everyone else can't see the back of your head. So most of the time, the back of my head is a mess because I can see the front and I can kind of shave it off. And actually, all I did was just shave it all off. So I just had what was called a skiffle. That's what it was known as. Zero, shave it all off. Now, as I went through the years and my comic collection got bigger and my haircuts became more frequent and I got kind of less likely to go to the barbershop, I found myself sort of distanced from this hub. Because when you think about it, I've moved from the innocent, that was the first archetype. Then I became the trickster when I worked out how to save money. And now I'm the wanderer because I don't go to the barber anymore. And I kind of forget what it's like to go to the barber. In a weird sort of way, I've done a bit of a split, like a parallel split. And I've gone off in a direction that I probably shouldn't have, because now I don't know what goes on in the barbershop. And the barbershop is a hub of Black masculinity in many ways. And it's connected to the Black community. It's where hair gets done, it's where people meet. And I've separated myself from that. So years later, I'm in New York. I did that Camp America thing when British kids go over to work on summer camps in America. And I spent a summer in New York State along the East Coast. And I decided I need a haircut, but I haven't got my own clippers with me because I traveled. So I go to a barbershop in New York. And I felt like I was going into a space that I would recognize. I felt like I was going to a space that was an extension of the nest. But I very, very quickly realized that I feel out of place. There's something in the rhythm of the barbershop that I'm not accustomed to anymore. And I end up getting a really, really bad haircut from a really good barber, partly because I think there was some weird tension there. I'll let you work out what kind of story this is, but it's not over yet. Because, time flies, I grow, I get older, and actually, because I'm doing it myself every couple of weeks, my haircuts actually get better. Like, I get really good at cutting my own hair. If you look at me now, not bigging myself up, but it looks all right, and it's a skill that I've accrued over time. So now I'm comfortable in my own ability to cut my own hair, but I still feel like a visitor when I'm in those spaces. I'll be really open. I'll break the fourth wall. When I lived in East London, I thought, let me try and go to the barber every now and again, just to see, especially when I moved into new areas. It's quite a good way of getting a feel, a measure of the place. And I go in and I felt like a visitor. I felt those nerves again. I felt like the orphan, if you want to talk about the archetypes. I felt without parents. I didn't have a sense of ballast with which to feel comfortable in that space. I accepted terrible service and terrible haircuts out of politeness. I'd walk in and I'll just queue up, and you're going to get a bad haircut when you just walk in and you're queuing up because you're not a regular. And one of the barbers one time, because I think I went maybe 3 times in total over a period of maybe 6 years, I went to an actual barber to cut my hair just to see. And one of the barbers once looked at me and he went, "Where you been cutting your hair?" Right? It was a suspicious question. And he was right to be suspicious because I hadn't been cutting my hair anyway. I'd been doing it myself. So I made up something about having recently moved into the area. We got chatting, but I never quite felt settled. Cut to school, same school where that girl told me I shouldn't call my book H is for hairline. And one of the kids, he always had a really sharp haircut. He looks at me one day. He's always looking at me out of the corner of his eye. And I can tell he's looking at my haircut because, as I say, I'm getting good at it. And he's at the age where it's important. He's probably roughly the age when I decided to forego barbershop for comics. He's probably that kind of age. And he's looking at me and he says, "Where'd you get your haircut, sir?" And I lie. I actually made up a barber. I just made up a barbershop and I said it wasn't around here. And I'm thinking, why am I lying? Why am I lying about this? It's an odd thing. What is it about this journey of cutting my own hair and separating myself, cutting myself off from the place where you will go to get your hair cut? What is it that made me feel so insecure? You know, like all the best stories, this is about my security and my insecurity. Because now I'm securely good in my ability to cut my own hair, but I'm insecure in my ability to be open about that in the communities of which I'm part. It's deep. Now I am good, and I'm so good I can cut other people's hair, members of my family, friends' kids. It's like a hobby for me. And weirdly enough, I found a new community of barbers through the internet. It's amazing. This is my phone over here. Every night I go on Instagram while my kids are going to sleep, and I just like look at barbers. I'm really revealing everything here. I follow loads of barber accounts, and I speak to these barbers in emojis, like little flame emoji or a little fist, to show my appreciation of their work. Now, archetype-wise, maybe I'm a bit of a sage. If I could time travel, I could go back in time and I could give myself an amazing haircut now. I know how to do it properly. I've got lots of equipment. I've bought many clippers to the point where I should go pro. You know, maybe that's the retirement plan. But this is not about that. This is about identity. It's about belonging, you know? It's about blackness. Because when you pick this story apart, and I've had to do that to make sense of why I'm telling it to you, because I don't want to waste anyone's time here. When you pick it apart, this is about what I belong to and where I place my identity, where I find my context. Because I grew up in Brixton. Brixton is one of the blackest places in the country, fact, you know? And now I live in East Yorkshire, probably one of the whitest places in the country, fact. So I find a sense of myself in this thing that I can do. It's probably why I'm compelled to reach out to other barbers, probably why I cut people's hair, friends and family and so on. It's about self-sufficiency and the sacrifice that comes with that. Because let me cut to the chase. I haven't got long. Blackness, this concept, blackness, is often about survival within whiteness. That's how it was set up when these binaries were created in the 1660s. You know, it doesn't mean anything logically, black and white. And yet for some reason, the year 2022, we're still using these terms. I've still got books that have got black in the title. That binary means that you kind of have to navigate very, very harsh and restrictive spaces for identity. And you have to carry that within you. It can be lonely, you know? When I've been wandering into barbershops, trying to work out if I fit in, that's a lonely feeling. But at the same time, it's a process of learning. I've learned how to present myself and construct myself. This is ongoing work. This is my life's work. I go out into the world and I can present myself in a way that's acceptable, not only to me, but to the people that see me. I can give myself a good haircut. It's a journey. And a lot of it is silent struggle and hidden celebration. Think about it. No one knows what, well, now you guys do, because I've just told you, but no one else knows what it's taken for me to get to the point where I can pop a fade on my own head, give myself an adequate haircut and step out into the world. No one knows the celebration that that comes with when I can give myself the facsimile of a good haircut. I'm literally shaping my identity. And as I said, hair means something to me because it's not just hair, it's a community, it's a heritage. You could call it a heritage if you wanted to muck about with words, but that's a terrible, terrible pun. It's finding your way. And finding your way is something that you really feel that you're doing when you leave the village. Now, there's a much wider story here, you know, because the Black diaspora, when you think about what's happened to people who are racialized as Black since the 1660s, when Immanuel Kant said, you know, humanity exists in its greatest perfection in the white race, when he said that, one of many, many eminent thinkers of the Enlightenment period, you know, like white European men, always wealthy white European men, because they're at the absolute apex. When he said that, he was creating a vision or positing a thesis that would seed and take root in society to this very day. This idea of whiteness being supreme. And what it did to anyone who was racialized as Black, anyone who was not white, was that it completely separated us from a sense of just default normality. And that is something of a tragedy when you look at what's happened to humanity, you know, since that time and throughout history. It set in motion a series of events that compelled many people who were othered to have to reassemble themselves, you know? Like, come on, the numbers don't lie. When you think about it, when you add it up, there's only about 3% Black people in this country. That's not a lot of people. Piers Morgan's got more followers on Twitter than there are Black people in this country, like easily. It's not even a fair fight. And when you add it all up, most of those Black people, like 98%, live in London, where I grew up. So that actually leaves about 700,000 people who are racialized as Black scattered around the rest of the country on this journey of maybe of isolation, finding communities where there's no obvious village. Being othered is work, it's effort. It can be really lonely because when you're othered, your whole position is being defined by what you're not, and you didn't choose it. Now, I'm going to wrap up in a minute, but there's one final archetype, if you've been paying attention. There's an archetype called the magician. You know, all the best stories have them. And I think I've been the magician. You know, I'm going to be kind to myself here. I think that I've made magic on this journey of self-constructed identity making. Because when you take a label that society has given you and you wear it outwardly, and not only wear it, but you turn it into ballast for yourself, you're doing magic. And I think that that's an amazing thing because we've all got labels that decenter us, you know? Power centers itself. Whiteness centered itself. That's the white supremacy mission. Masculinity centers itself. It's called patriarchy. We live in a deeply sexist society, you know? Homophobia exists because heteronormativity is centered itself, usually linked to patriarchy and so on. So when you are othered through no fault of your own and you wear that identity, you're doing magic. I'm going to wrap up in a second, but all I want to say is I kind of want to dedicate this story to anyone and everyone who is marginalized in any way and has actually made an identity out of what was intended to denigrate them, who has not only lived with it and survived it, but thrived in it, because that is the work of life. And that's something which we can all celebrate ourselves and we should all celebrate for each other. So I'm going to wrap up there. And thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my story of haircuts, comics, and identity finding.
Jeffrey, that was so brilliant. Thank you so much for wrapping us up on such a powerful, inspiring, and magical note. It was the perfect and surprising story. Musical Truth is out now. So that was such an extraordinary group of speakers. It was absolutely incredible and fantastic for 5x15 to be able to work with Writers Mosaic to bring that together. I want to say a few words of thanks. Thanks to Ladbury PR, to Writers Mosaic, the whole team. Thanks to 5x15, to all of our audience who've been with us this evening. Please buy the books. All of our speakers have incredible books, which are out now. And finally, a huge thanks to our incredible lineup, Gabriel, Angela, Paul, Ingrid, and Jeffrey. And join us again very, very soon. But for now, good night.